Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The station smelled like three different atmospheres arguing with each other, and Marcus Vale had been breathing the results for 6 hours. He had noticed it the moment the shuttle docked, a faint, layered quality to the recycled air aboard the Meridian Accord that suggested the environmental systems were working very hard to keep everyone alive and only partially succeeding at keeping everyone comfortable. There was something floral underneath it all, sweet in a way that wasn't quite right, like a flower that had studied other flowers from a description rather than from experience. He had mentioned this to the corps attaché who had met him at the docking ring, a brisk woman named Sira Chin, who had the expression of someone who had been asked to care about many things today and had run out. She had told him it was the Velhari atmospheric supplement, that the Confederation's member species processed nitrogen differently, and the station's life support had been adjusted to accommodate the overlap, and that most humans stopped noticing it after about 40 minutes. Marcus had nodded. He was still noticing it. The Meridian Accord was extraordinary and uncomfortable in equal measure, which he suspected was the point. It occupied a geostationary position above Cethara IV, a colony world whose rust-colored plains and triple moons had appeared on more diplomatic brochures in the last 3 years than any other location in the outer territories, largely because the compact negotiations had needed a backdrop, and someone in the Corps Communications office had an eye for symbolism and a very good camera. From certain viewports, the planet's largest moon sat precisely above the horizon of the second, creating the illusion of one world stacked on another. A coincidence of orbital geometry that the Velhari delegation had apparently found so resonant with one of their foundational cosmological metaphors that it had been cited twice in the preamble of the first compact. Marcus had looked up the metaphor. He had then spent 20 minutes trying to understand the translation, concluded that it had something to do with the idea that all proximity is accidental and all meaning is chosen, and decided this was either very profound or completely circular, possibly both. He was not, by any measure he could apply honestly, an important person at this event. His function, as near as he could determine after reviewing the briefing documents on the shuttle, was to exist with cultural competence in a room where his existence was required for the numbers to look right. The third compact dinner needed 22 human representatives and 22 Velhari counterparts, and Marcus was number 19, placed there because he had scored in the upper third on his cross-cultural sensitivity assessment, owned formal where that fit without alteration, and had not, in 4 years with the diplomatic corps, caused a significant incident. This last qualification had been listed in his assignment brief under the heading Positive Attributes, which he found both gratifying and slightly dispiriting. He had prepared. This was the thing he wanted it noted, at least internally, for the record. He had read the cultural briefings. He had reviewed the etiquette guidelines for formal Velhari dining events, the injunction against initiating physical contact, the importance of maintaining a neutral expression during the first course as a gesture of social respect, the 7 categories of conversational topic considered appropriate for cross-species diplomatic small talk, which were climate variation across colonized worlds, the engineering of the station itself, the historical significance of the compact, the diversity of human agricultural products, general observations about translation technology, comparative stellar cartography, and the challenge of maintaining circadian rhythms in artificial environments. He had prepared remarks on 4 of these. He had even, somewhat ambitiously, learned to say, "I appreciate this meeting in phonetic Velhari," which Sira Chin had reviewed and told him was close, though the tonal inflection he was giving it suggested something more like, "I find this adequately tolerable," which she said was probably fine. The hall itself made him feel small in a way he had not entirely anticipated. The bioluminescent ceiling panels shifted color in slow, tidal movements, amber to a deep, soft blue when conversations grew quieter, cycling back toward gold as the room filled with sound again. And the total effect was of a living thing breathing around him, patient and enormous. The tables were long and set with two parallel arrangements of implements, human silverware on the outer edge, and the Velhari feeding instruments on the inner, which were jointed and elegant and looked to Marcus's eye like something a watchmaker would design if asked to construct a fork and had never seen food. He sat down. He placed his napkin in his lap. He looked at the Velhari feeding instruments for a moment longer than was necessary. He decided firmly that they were not his concern this evening. He was on his second glass of water and his fourth review of the correct pronunciation of "I appreciate this meeting," when the seating arrangement changed. She arrived the way significant things sometimes do, sideways, through a disruption in something else. A minor reshuffling of the seating arrangement, caused by a protocol dispute Marcus was not senior enough to be informed about, sent two diplomatic staff members moving along the table with the quiet urgency of people fixing a problem before it became a story. And when they finished, the chair to Marcus's left was occupied by someone who had not been there before. Her name was in his briefing documents. He knew this because he had read them 3 times on the shuttle and retained very little. But the name Edith Sornkale had appeared on the 3rd page under a heading that translated, roughly, as Cultural Liaison Prime for the Velhari Confederation's 3rd House. And next to the name was a small photograph that had prepared him for approximately none of what was currently sitting 2 feet to his left. She looked at a distance, almost entirely human. She was dressed in something dark and structured that suggested ceremony without announcing it, and she held herself with the stillness of a person who has attended so many formal dinners that the formality has become indistinguishable from rest. It was only when she turned to accept a glass from the serving staff that Marcus saw the light beneath her skin, not bright, not dramatic, just present. A slow luminescence that moved in the way that warmth moves, felt more than seen, and understood, with a lurch of recalibration somewhere behind his sternum, that he had underestimated the word almost. She did not look at him immediately. She surveyed the table with the composed assessment of someone who has learned to read a room without appearing to read a room, and Marcus watched this happen with the specific interest of a person who has just become aware that they are in the presence of someone considerably more practiced at existing than he is. He reached for his water glass, moved it 2 centimeters to the left for no reason, and then became aware that this was not a thing that needed to happen and returned it to its original position. She glanced at him. He smiled. She returned her attention to the table. The silence between them settled and found its shape. When she spoke first, it was in standard so precise it made his own sound approximate. She asked whether the station's temperature regulation was adequate for human physiology. He recognized the question for what it was, not small talk exactly, but the diplomatic equivalent of a door left slightly open, and answered honestly, which was not always his first instinct but was, he'd found, consistently his most interesting one. He told her the temperature felt calibrated to satisfy no one completely, which he suspected was architectural diplomacy. A building designed to distribute mild discomfort equally, so that no species could claim advantage. She looked at him for a moment with her layered amber eyes, and he noticed, for the first time, something behind the first pupil. A second one, deeper, perfectly still, like a detail in a painting that you find only when you stop looking for it. She said his observation was more accurate than she had expected. He received this as the highest compliment the sentence was structurally capable of carrying and thanked her accordingly. After that, the conversation moved. Not quickly, it was not that kind of conversation, but with the steady, inevitable drift of something following a current neither of them had consciously chosen. She spoke about standard with the particular frustration of someone who has thought about a problem so thoroughly that politeness no longer covers all of it. She described the experience of translating Velhari emotional vocabulary into a language she said had been optimized for being understood rather than for being accurate. The way a photograph is optimized for being clear rather than for being true. Marcus listened in the way he listened when he was actually interested, which was with his entire body slightly forward and his water glass forgotten. He had been told, in 3 separate cultural sensitivity seminars, to be an active listener during Velhari interactions. He didn't think about this once. He was simply listening. Then she mentioned the 17 words for disappointed, and something in the structure of the evening rearranged itself permanently. She listed them without performance, the way you list things you have known for a long time and stopped finding remarkable. The word for the disappointment that is secretly relief. The word for being disappointed by news that arrived 1 hour too late. The word for the particular feeling of having expected too much of a situation you'd been warned about. Marcus listened to all 17 with the focused attention of a man receiving very specific gifts he hadn't asked for and was surprised to find he wanted. When she finished, she observed, quietly, that Standard appeared to manage with approximately 1.5. He asked about the half. She said, "Let down," which she had concluded was simply disappointed said while looking slightly downward, and she was not entirely certain it qualified as distinct. He laughed, and she watched this happen with the expression of someone filing it carefully. He was still thinking about the half-word when he started talking, not performing a thought, but finding one while speaking, which was how his best sentences tended to arrive, slightly ahead of his awareness that he was building them. He said that the asymmetry made a kind of sense to him, actually. That humans were genuinely terrible at granular disappointment, that they tended to experience it as a weather event rather than a taxonomy, but that they had, perhaps as compensation, developed an extraordinary relationship with the opposite, with the good thing that arrived without warning, with being caught off guard by something better than expected. He said humans had invested enormous, underappreciated cultural energy into the architecture of the unexpected gift, had a word for it, even, that hadn't been exported widely yet. Serendipity, which was the specific joy of the unplanned good thing, and which had, he said, at least 17 cousins that they also hadn't gotten around to translating. He delivered the last part the way you deliver something when you realize, a moment before it lands, that it is going to land. And then he reached for his water glass with the unconscious reflex of someone trying to look like they hadn't just noticed their own timing and did not knock it, and looked faintly surprised by this, and she laughed. He would think about that laugh for a long time afterward. Not obsessively, or not only obsessively, but with the particular quality of attention you give to something that arrived without warning and rearranged the furniture on its way in. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It was not loud. It was not the kind of laugh that announces itself. It was, if anything, the opposite, a laugh that seemed to surprise the person producing it, that arrived ahead of whatever internal permission system Edith Sornkale had in place for public emotional expression, and got through before the gate came down. And it was warm. That was the thing Marcus kept returning to when he turned it over later, the specific quality of its warmth, not performed, not diplomatic, not the careful facsimile of amusement that he had heard at 6 other tables in this room tonight in the careful key of cross-cultural courtesy. It was warm the way something is warm when it comes from inside rather than from a decision. The room noticed. This was not subtle, and Marcus, to his credit, noticed that it was not subtle in real time rather than in retrospect. The conversations at the 2 nearest tables underwent the specific modulation that conversations undergo when something unexpected has occurred nearby. Not stopping, exactly, but losing about 30% of their momentum, while the people having them performed the social calculation of whether to look directly or process the information peripherally, and pretend they hadn't. 3 people looked directly. A junior diplomatic staff member near the far wall, A young woman whose entire professional posture had been one of watchful composure all evening, glanced at her colleague with an expression that completed a sentence neither of them said aloud. Marcus was familiar with that particular exchange. He had been on the receiving end of it at other events, usually after saying something that had seemed very reasonable at the time. Edith composed herself quickly, not with the deliberate effortfulness of suppression, but with the fluid speed of someone for whom composure is the resting state rather than the goal. Her hair, which Marcus had been noticing without analyzing for most of the evening, settled. The luminescence beneath her skin, which had brightened fractionally in a way he'd registered as warmth without identifying as information, returned to its usual depth. She was, within moments, precisely as she had been. Her second pupil returned to its position behind the first. She reached for her own glass, without incident, Marcus noted, and there was a beat, a brief diplomatic pause in which the evening seemed to hold itself still, and then she turned to the dignitary seated on her other side. He was a senior Velhari official, older in some quality that wasn't quite visible in the way age is visible in humans but was present in his stillness, in the density of his attention. Marcus didn't know his name. He had been introduced to so many people in the last 6 hours that his working memory had quietly unionized and gone on strike somewhere around the 4th hour, retaining only the information it considered essential and releasing everything else with dignity. Edith spoke to this official in Velhari, the language that sounded like layered harmonics filtered through the specific frequency of something that is always asking and answering simultaneously, and her tone was entirely conversational, explanatory, the tone of someone providing context for an observable event, the way you might turn to a friend at a film and briefly explain a joke they hadn't caught. She gestured while speaking in Marcus's direction. The gesture was easy, unelaborate, the kind of motion that belongs to the word him, rather than any more specific designation. The translation system aboard the Meridian Accord was the Syndicate 9 model. Marcus knew this because it was in the station briefing documents, listed under Communication Infrastructure, and he had read those documents 3 times. The Syndicate 9 was considered the most capable Velhari standard rendering system available at the time of the compact negotiations, with a contextual disambiguation architecture that processed not just vocabulary but register, intent, relational context, and 17,000 categorized edge cases designed specifically to prevent the kind of error that turns one word into a completely different word that means something enormous. It had a standard accuracy rating of 99.3%. Marcus had found this figure reassuring when he read it. He was revising this position in real time. The word the system chose, the word it delivered into the translation earpiece he wore, in the clear and unambiguous synthetic voice of a 99.3% accurate piece of technology that had processed 17,000 edge cases and arrived, confidently, here, was husband. Edith Sornkale was explaining to her colleague, in the conversational tone of someone providing a brief and unremarkable clarification, that her husband had made a remark about human vocabulary, and this was why she had laughed. She used the word without stress, without ceremony, in the grammatical position of a noun that had recently and straightforwardly become applicable. The Syndicate 9 delivered it with equal confidence. Neither of them seemed to find any of this remarkable. Marcus found it extremely remarkable. He experienced the 2 seconds following the word's arrival in his earpiece in a way that he would later describe, when trying to explain it to someone who had not been there, as a software update happening to his entire understanding of the last 40 minutes while he was still using it. He looked at the water glass. The water glass was excellent. He was going to look at it for a moment. He heard, at the edge of his awareness, 2 or 3 other guests shifting in the specific way that people shift when they have heard something they are deciding whether to respond to, and chose, correctly, not to respond to. The senior Velhari official inclined his head in the way that Marcus was learning to read as recognition rather than surprise, which meant that the word had not surprised him, which meant the word was not an error, which meant, and here was where the software update reached a stage that required a full restart, that the word was not an error. He put the water glass down. He turned slowly back toward Edith. She was already looking at him. Her expression was composed and patient and contained in the layered amber behind the layered amber, something that he would need significantly more data to accurately name, but which had the quality, tentative, careful, present of someone who has just realized that a step they took without looking has landed on ground that exists but wasn't expected. He said her name first, not because it was the right opening. He had no idea what the right opening was, had no briefing document for this, had prepared remarks on stellar cartography and circadian rhythms and the diversity of human agricultural products, and absolutely nothing for the situation he was currently in. But because saying her name bought him one additional second in which to locate the version of himself that was capable of handling this with something resembling grace. Edith, she waited. He was learning, very good at waiting, he said. The translation system used a specific word just now. She said she was aware. He said, I want to make sure I understood it correctly. She said that this was reasonable, he said. It said husband. She said yes. He said, after a pause that contained an entire internal conversation he did not have time to finish. Was that the translation system making a choice? Or was that the translation system doing its job? Edith looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has just watched a person walk slowly to the edge of a conclusion and would like to let them arrive there on their own terms. She said quietly that in this particular case, the Syndicate 9 had performed with complete accuracy. He picked up his water glass. He put it down without drinking from it. He said, right. What she explained to him over the following minutes, she delivered with the careful precision of someone who understands that they are handing another person a significant amount of new information and is trying to release it at a speed the other person's system can absorb. She spoke about the third house. She spoke about reserve, about a species that does not display unguarded emotion in formal settings as a matter of deep cultural architecture, not courtesy, not performance, but genuine internal construction. The way some structures are built without windows not because of darkness, but because of what windows would cost. She told him that among her people, attempting to make a third house Velhari laugh in a ceremonial context was not casual, was not small talk, was not the social equivalent of commenting on the temperature regulation. It was, and here she paused, in the way she paused when she was selecting words with the care of someone who knows the available options and trusts none of them completely, an act of profound social intention. It assumed familiarity. It assumed that the other person was worth the risk of being seen finding something funny. It was, in the framework her culture had built across several centuries of careful emotional architecture, an overture. And if the person laughed genuinely without managing it before the gate came down, this was the answer to that overture. The ceremony, she said, was the laughter itself. Not words, not rings, not paperwork. Two people, in one unguarded moment, telling each other something true. The laugh was the contract, and both parties had signed it, and the appropriate word for the other party, in all subsequent reference, was the word the Syndicate 9 had delivered with its 99.3% confidence into his left ear 12 minutes ago. Marcus sat with this for a moment that he was aware, even as he sat in it, was going to be one of the more formative moments of his life. He was 34 years old. He had a small apartment on the 3rd Setharan Colonial Station that contained too many books in physical format, and a coffee maker he had owned for 6 years, and named Gerald. He had been to 11 diplomatic events in 4 years and caused 0 significant incidents, and he had been quietly proud of this. And he understood now that the record was over, and that the manner of its ending was either the most absurd thing that had ever happened to him or the most important, and that the unsettling truth, sitting very still in the center of his chest, was that he was not sure these were different things. He thought about her laugh. He thought about the specific quality of it, the way it had arrived ahead of her composure, the warmth of it, the realness of it in a room full of people performing careful, managed versions of their warmth. He thought about 17 words for disappointed and the half a word for let down, and the way she had said, "We did not previously require one," 4 chapters ago in the summary of a story that was now, apparently, his actual life. He looked at Edith. She was watching him with her layered amber eyes and her careful stillness, and her hair had gone very quiet in the way he now understood was not calm, but effort, the specific effort of someone waiting for a verdict they have no power to change, and have decided to receive with dignity regardless. He noticed this. He noticed that she was nervous, and that she was working very hard not to show it, and that the working very hard was itself the most human thing he had seen her do all evening, which was not the word that applied to her, but which was the only word he had for the specific quality of being more visible in your effort to hide than in the thing you're hiding. He said because he was the kind of person who says things before they're finished, who finds the sentence by starting it and trusts the rest to follow. He said, "I want to be honest with you about something." She said she appreciated honesty. He said, "I didn't know what I was doing when I made the joke. I didn't know what it meant in your context. I didn't know the tradition. I wasn't being intentional in the way your framework requires intentionality." She said she understood. He said, "But I was being intentional in the other way." She waited. He said, "I wanted you to find it funny. I wanted to make you laugh specifically. I wasn't trying to perform for the room. You were the audience." That part, and here he stopped and located something careful and true in himself and said it. That part I meant. The room had recovered itself around them. Conversations had resumed their careful diplomatic frequencies. The bioluminescent ceiling had returned to gold. Somewhere to Marcus's right, a junior attaché was explaining something about comparative stellar cartography that no one was listening to. The Velhari official on Edith's other side had turned politely away, with the grace of someone who understands that some conversations require a perimeter. The station continued its geostationary patience above Cethara IV, the triple moons holding their ancient orbital positions, indifferent to what was happening in the dining hall below, with the magnificent indifference of objects that have been where they are for longer than intention has existed. Edith was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My tradition does not have a mechanism for retroactive unlaughing." He said he had suspected as much. She said,